event, which we will be discussing tonight.
Her soul consciousness may have had enough power to say, okay, this reality is a bunch of blase nonsense. We're going to go on to something else right now. No, it's just like dying or passing, which I love that word too. All right. In other words, my death is going to be different than everybody else's death. Whether or not I know what it is just for me. Some people can experience their own death in the here and now because they can consciously walk into, at any time they want to, another reality. In other words, it's another reality.
1 year before the murder-suicide, that was Michael's voice at the group. And he was talking about the way I look at it, if it was tomorrow, I'd go to sleep, I'd be ready. My death is going to be different to everybody else's death. Some people can experience their own death in the here and now. It was about 4:30 on the afternoon of Tuesday, September 8, 1981. The two children, boys 11 and 6 years old, walked home from school after getting off the school bus and seeing their mother's car was back in the driveway. Catherine had been gone to Kentucky for 5 weeks and had arrived back Monday, September the 7th, Labor Day night. Michael had already gotten home from Dallas on Friday. When the children came in and discovered the horrifying scene, they immediately called their grandmother, Catherine's mother. The scene was shocking. Catherine was on the bed, 2 .22 caliber rifle shots to her head. Seated next to the bed, leaning against the dresser, was the body of Michael, who had apparently committed suicide by shooting himself in the head after killing Catherine. In the kitchen, a strange occult symbol was done on the tabletop. Michael had drawn a pyramid with an eye hovering over it, with a man and woman holding hands walking down a pathway toward a dark door in the front of the pyramid. Below the pyramid were written these words: life, death, and dying. A number of occult and mystical books from Michael's mass library of esoteric literature was nearby. That's the scene. And we have a caller, I see, from Illinois. Good evening.
Hi, Rich. I just wanted to ask, when and how did Michael and Catherine meet?
They met in Dallas in the Metroplex whenever they were working together at Level or Blinds. And they developed a relationship at that time in the late 70s and began living together. One apartment after another. They were in more than one place. And then they ended up coming to the, moving out into the country where the incident, the murder-suicide occurred. They had moved out there by early 1980, and the event itself happened in September of 81.
I see. Were they?
This is episode 2 of the Michael-Katherine Apocryphon by Rich Vernadeau, Jeffrey Richard Vernadeau. This is the second edition here of this ongoing audio and video series, which is an audio book, a video book, if you will. Characteristics of the relationship Michael and Catherine had included an almost obsessive concern on Michael's part about Catherine's whereabouts and well-being. This was matched in equal intensity by an almost deliberate willfulness and independence on Catherine's part to go wherever she pleased without even informing Michael or the children at times. Michael thus became very upset and agitated whenever she was gone, very worried about where she was and whether or not she was safe and when she would be back. Michael once stated quite accurately, Katherine does what Katherine wants. Katherine had been in Kentucky during the 6 weeks prior to the murder-suicide and had returned simply to get her stuff. She was planning on going back to Kentucky to stay with her sister. And, of course, Michael shot her in her sleep the next day. During that 6 weeks prior to the murder-suicide, Michael himself had been in Dallas and had just come back to the house there in Novice a few days before Katherine's arrival. Michael had been staying in a YMCA room in Dallas, and $200 had been stolen from Michael's YMCA room when Katherine's mother, Frances, had picked Michael up in Dallas, and they were on their way back to Paris. They had stopped at the Stuckey's to eat a hamburger, and they sat down and were talking, and tears rolled down Michael's face, and he said, "I have sunk so low." Michael said he had taken 25 Quaaludes to try to leave this reality, to try to end it all. And apparently he survived that attempt. There are interesting aspects to the murder-suicide. There are pieces of the puzzle of the deaths of Michael and Katherine. In Vietnam and afterwards, Michael had a friend named George. And George had disappeared in the Bahamas, and this is talked about at one of the discussion groups, and in fact that will be another episode. Michael did not know what happened to George. There was never a body found, and that's an interesting mystery in and of itself. Michael said that there was a death pattern. He talked about his first wife and child being killed in an accident involving a drunk driver in Fort Worth in 1962. I'll also talk about that incident. I'll elaborate on that incident more in a future episode. There was a time several months before the murder-suicide when Katherine had felt physically threatened by forces. Several people in the discussion group had some incidents occur during a certain weekend. There was a point at which Michael asked one of the discussion group members to buy him a gun. That person, of course, refused. Michael had talked about suicide to Frances, Katherine's mother. At one point during one of the discussion groups, and I have this on audio cassette tape, and I will be presenting it during one of the episodes, Michael said, "Suicide, picking up a gun and shooting yourself. Death, as I understand it, is pure escapism." Michael went on to say, "To a certain extent, we are all going to die by our own hand." And then Michael had said, "My death is going to be different to anybody else's. Whether or not I know what it is just for me." Now, those three statements were made during the same discussion group meeting, September 16th of 1980. They precede the murder-suicide by almost exactly 1 year. So there was suicidal ideation in Michael's mind up to a year prior to the event. Michael carried no driver's license, had no checking account, and no ID. At one point, Michael had been diagnosed as manic-depressive by a psychologist. There was a woman named Carol Nelson who had studied some occult and metaphysical things with Michael, and she died mysteriously. Was either considered a suicide or perhaps natural causes, but there was an investigation into her death. Father Jensen had also visited and talked with Carol Nelson, and so had Bob Guffey. And, of course, Father Jensen and Bob Guffey were both people who attended the discussion group, the weekly discussion group that Michael founded. The investigation into Michael and Katherine's murder-suicide lasted for 3 months. Michael could be jealous, possessive, and got very angry from time to time. He realized Katherine was leaving him permanently to go back to Kentucky. This could have been the triggering incident that caused him to kill her and then himself. Frances, Katherine's mother, had a dream about Katherine shortly after the incident, and at one point she felt that Katherine had communicated with her shortly after the incident. Father Jensen reported Michael appearing to him after Michael's death with the message, "Tell the people I was deceived, Satan is real." Now, this appearance to Father Jensen allegedly occurred during the same time that prior to Michael's funeral, when Michael's body was at the funeral home. Frances, Catherine's mother, Frances, in visiting Michael's grave, felt a heaviness and a sorrow over Michael's grave. Here's more quotes from Michael. "Basically, I am not a community person. What I have is mine. What I do is mine. The way I look at death, if it was tomorrow morning, I'd go to sleep and I'd be ready. Some people can experience their own death in the here and now." In another quote, he says, "I know why I'm here, and it's for a good reason. To help where I can, to give something, to enlighten somebody." Catherine's mother, Frances, after Michael's suicide, encountered his father, and Michael's father made the remark, "I didn't think he had the guts." Frances got upset with him for saying that about his son. Frances went on to say, "That weekend before Kathy got back and the murder-suicide occurred, something told me I should get those rifles. They were Kathy's, out of the house. Michael told me he hadn't slept for 3 days. I could tell he was completely out of it. He seemed to be under the influence of some drugs, and it scared me. I believe he had been planning what he did up to a year earlier. Kathy never believed that he would actually harm her. Michael asked me for Kathy's tape recorder, which was at my house at the time. I'm sure he was planning to leave a taped suicide message, but I never brought him the recorder." And I think that will, for the time being, wrap up this second edition, the second chapter in the Michael-Katherine Apocryphon. This has been Rich Vernadeau, Jeffrey Richard Vernadeau. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening. Remember to hear the rest of the series, and there will be a number, obviously a large number of episodes after this one, because there's a great deal of material here that we're dealing with. Thank you very much.
One or two people who were challenging some of the statements that Michael was making. So Michael and Katherine simply stopped attending the group after about 10 or 12 meetings into the group. But the group itself continued to go ahead and meet every week, even after they stopped coming to it.
He was trying to control the group, wasn't he?
Yeah, he definitely wanted to be in control of the group, and he did not like it if he felt that he wasn't, or he felt that
probably anyone that disagreed with him, he probably, if he didn't get angry, he didn't like it.
I would say, yeah, if he wasn't in control, then he was angry.
Yeah.
And so maybe his control over her became stronger because he has that need for power. A narcissist has such need for power and such need for almost like worship, which is kind of what you're talking about, Michael.
Yeah.
Narcissists are scary. There's a group on Reddit called Raised by Narcissists. That'll turn your hair white. It's reading people's actual experiences.
I'll bet. I read a book by a girl who had escaped from Dianetics, from Scientology, and her parents were both high up in Scientology, and her personal accounts of her childhood is pretty horrendous. And I can't remember the girl's name right now, but it'd be easy enough to Google. But she didn't escape Scientology until she became an adult. She escaped in her early 20s, and then she wrote this very scathing, revealing book about life inside Scientology and the type of control that she was subjected to and that her parents wielded, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's pretty hair-raising. It's even scarier when you think that, people like Tom Cruise and John Travolta, are part of that. Of course, the celebrities are wined and dined and treated like royalty within Scientology because they're good publicity to bring the average Joe in there.
Yeah, I had heard at one point that Katie Holmes was even picked for Tom Cruise to marry.
I could believe
Scientology.
that. Because she was so innocent?
Well, I don't know exactly why, but that's what I had heard or read, was that the Scientology church picked her for him.
Wouldn't surprise me from what I read in this young lady's account. That type of manipulation and attempted control over people's lives, it wouldn't surprise me a bit. It really wouldn't.
Yeah.
That's disgusting.
Absolutely it is.
Very sad. Maybe more sad than disgusting.
A little of both, really.
Yeah, the people fall for it.
Yeah, I can't believe people fall for that stuff. It's just, to me, it's just mind-boggling. But in the case of Jim Jones, it's just unbelievable to me.
Yeah.
That 900 people or plus, took Kool-Aid laced with cyanide and even gave it to their children because Jim Jones told them to do it.
It was either they took it or he shot them.
Yeah, but most of them took it willingly.
Yeah, because they believed him.
Henry, what's your observation on the gullibleness of people that will succumb to that sort of thing?
Well, we have that's a good question. You have in attachment styles. You have the avoidant style, and which they generally turn out to be narcissists, and you have the anxious style. They generally turn out to be attracted to narcissists because their realities are they agree with each other. In other words, the narcissist has the attitude, I'm great and you're shit, and the anxious person has the attitude of I'm shit and you're great, so they reinforce each other's reality. That the anxious person is attracted to the narcissist. It's a equals repel, opposites attract principle, but what happens is the one that's in control, let's say the like the Shades of Grey scenario, like the guy was in control of the girl and did bad things to her and everything. And this was in line with her view of herself already, so it was reinforcing what she already knew about herself, or what she already felt she knew about herself.
I want to weigh in with, based on what you just said there, I want to weigh in with this insight into the relationship between Michael and Catherine. The sister that Catherine was going to move in with, the one up in Kentucky, that sister had been to Dallas a year or two earlier, and the very first night that she had gone to Michael and Catherine's apartment, the very first time that she met Michael, she felt so edgy around Michael that she told Catherine's mother she didn't even wish to sleep there in the apartment with him for even one night. Consequently, Catherine's mother and the sister went and stayed over at the grandmother's house. Catherine's sister could tell that Catherine was intensely fascinated with Michael. Michael and Catherine would talk for hours and hours in deep intellectual conversations on spiritual and mystical matters. They attended spiritualist services together and Silva mind control classes. Catherine's mother was somewhat bothered by Michael's hold over Catherine, and she told Kathy, he has a ring in your nose and he's just pulling you and leading you along.
And she didn't listen, right?
No, she didn't listen. Catherine rebelled against her mother, too. She was very willful, very headstrong, very rebellious.
Yep. Been there, done that. Yeah, everything you're telling me about Michael is things I've seen with the other narcissist. Just horrendous. That's who he was. That's, I don't know. The only difference is in this situation, he's found a new, younger victim.
Mm-hmm.
So, you kind of have to wonder what will happen. You know what I'm saying? I don't know.
Let me, can I finish my thought on that. What I was going to
Yes.
say on that relationship with,
Yes.
between the master and the slave, the narcissist and the anxious type person.
Yeah.
What happens is, they don't see themselves as equals. He sees himself as better than her, and she also sees herself as worse than him. You know, so they agree. But what happens is, the worse he treats her, the worse she feels. And the worse she feels, then this justifies him to treat her even worse.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a downward spiral relationship, which eventually ends in either one of two things. She leaves him, or shoots him in the head at night, you know, or he leaves her because, you know, she's obviously used up. She's no good anymore. She's so far down below him that he needs to get somebody else. Or he shoots her and shoots himself, you know, because the reason he shoots himself, you have to remember that the narcissist, even though they have delusions of grandeur and they think they're better than everybody else consciously, subconsciously they know that they have very low self-esteem. There's nothing inside. There's nothing in their heart to sustain them. It's all an act.
You missed one, though. If she leaves him, even if he's moved on and has someone else, he will find her and kill her because she's his. He can have someone else. She cannot have someone else.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, if he can, he'll find her and kill her.
Yes.
Or beat her up or you know, whatever.
No, he'll kill her because she dared to leave him.
Right. They can't stand to
his money is his, her money is his, and the amount of money they can get out of everybody else is his also.
Right. What I'm saying is what attracts them together is they agree with each other. He says that he tells her she is shit, and she agrees with him.
Yes.
Yes, I am shit. That's what attracts them to each other.
Some of the other remarks that Michael had made, he had talked to Catherine's mother about suicide. He didn't mention, you know, any plans to kill Catherine, but he had talked to Catherine's mother about suicide. And at one point at the discussion group, Michael said, "Suicide, picking up a gun and shooting yourself, death, as I understand it, is pure escapism." At one point, Michael said, to a certain extent, we are all going to die by our own hand. And, of course, Michael said, my death is going to be different to anybody else's. Whether or not I know what it is just for me. Apparently, Michael had attempted to commit suicide in Dallas a few weeks prior to coming back and the event which occurred, of course. Apparently, he had taken 25 Quaaludes, and it did not kill him. You know, he survived that, slept it off after 3 or 4 days or whatever. Michael had been diagnosed as manic depressive by a psychologist.
Yep. I would have liked to have met him and her before that happened. I'm not saying that I could have prevented it or anything like that. I just said it would have been a fascinating case study in human nature, you know.
Oh, you would have found the discussion group meetings fascinating. They absolutely were.
I know, Rich, at one time you told me that you had spent a lot of time in their home.
Oh, yes, I had. I was out there quite frequently, quite a bit on the weekends. I would stay out there during the daytime quite a bit, and then sometimes I would spend the night there as well. And so
didn't you say that you almost went there the day of the murder-suicide. But
Yeah.
you ended up, you didn't have time, or you just didn't stop?
Well, it's interesting. This was about 15, 18 miles out in the country, and I had taken a friend of mine out there to work in the area that was adjacent to where Michael and Catherine's house were, where they lived. And I could have gone straight back to the city where I live, or I could have taken a left and gone about a mile down and been right there at Michael and Catherine's and stopped and visited. And I almost went down there that morning, the morning of the day that the murder-suicide occurred, but I was running late, and so I came on into town and to work. And so, I'm glad now that I didn't. I could easily have ended up as Michael's victim as well, had I stopped there.
Or maybe you could have prevented it.
I'm not so sure about that one. I think he was cagey and sophisticated and clever enough. He would not necessarily have indicated to me what he was going to do. It would have depended on how far into it he was. If he was already to the point of putting the notes on the table and loading the rifle with the ammunition or whatever, in other words, if that's an answer we'll never know. We'll never know the answer to whether I would have been able to prevent it or whether I would have become a victim. Obviously, what was meant
to happen
did happen. I'm still alive and I didn't go there. Go ahead.
But with just you being there, showing up, could have changed, the interactions for the day. Could have changed the whole course of the day.
Yeah,
for them.
And that's something we'll never know. No. I guess.
No.
I think he may have changed it for that day, but it still would have happened.
Probably, yes. Yeah.
It
was probably inevitable that he was going to kill him and her also.
So I may have simply postponed and delayed it had I stopped there. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. In my opinion, you wouldn't have delayed anything. He would have just took you out, get you out of the way.
Yeah.
I thought of that too. I agree. I would have become a victim had I stopped there.
I personally believe that we plan our lives before we come here, and I think that was their exit point, and they took it. And maybe they were here to teach people others lessons, or maybe they were here to teach each other a very, very powerful lesson. And I just don't think that was your lesson to learn, Rich. And that's why you chose the other way. There's a reason to think about what made you run late that day. Was it something stupid? Like, you just put your shoe in the wrong, like you accidentally put your shoe in a drawer or something, you know what I'm saying? Think about that, what stopped you. I was delayed once in a mall, couldn't get out. The errand should have taken no more than an hour, and it took me 4 hours to get out of there. And when I finally did take a different way home, I ended up rescuing a friend from a really bad accident. And, I think God puts us where we're supposed to be and keeps us from where we're not supposed to be.
Well, absolutely.
I've got a call coming. I'll have to cut off. I'll catch you later.
Well, thank you for calling in, Becky.
Will we lose Becky?
I'm sorry, Henry. Go ahead.
Did we lose Becky?
Yes, she had an incoming call. She had to leave us. You have some more observations you'd like to make about Michael?
Well, just that I would have liked to have met him. I'm a student of human nature, so I would have liked to have met him and her. I would have, been of education. The takeaway from this whole thing is, in my opinion, is people are not raising their kids right. What do you think?
Well, that's certainly one aspect of it. Human behavior is determined so much by the environment in which we're raised, so much by the example we're given by parents and by the things we're taught. So, you got to wonder a lot about all the different influences and how they play into how people end up, what actions people engage in.
Right.
Yeah, and I keep thinking to myself, the way that he grew up and didn't know, his parents or where he came from, or, He must have felt maybe very unloved.
I think so. And well, you know, his father, Michael, was raised in a strange way. His adopted father was a peculiar man who worked as an accountant and a museum curator at various times. And he would insist to Michael, he would tell him, don't talk to strangers. And, of course, there was this hush-hush secrecy about Michael's real parents. And Michael always had a funny feeling that his real parents and consequently himself were in some way kin to his adopted father. And that there were several people involved in the cover-up of his real parentage.
Do you know how old he was when he was adopted?
I'm going to say at birth, from the information I have. There must be a reason why you asked that question. How would it play into what you were attempting to
Well, you know,
research?
adoptees don't have adoptees usually their outcomes is not as good as biological children.
Mm-hmm.
And my theory is because they're mistreated before they're adopted out.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, there's early neglect and abuse in infancy.
Mm-hmm.
So no matter what happens after that, you're already scarred for life, you know.
I know a good friend of mine, she was adopted, her and her sister both. And her sister is not her biological sister. And she searched for several years to find her birth mother. And when she did, she wished that she hadn't, because she got to meet the woman, and the woman just had no interest in her whatsoever. And she didn't meet her until she was probably at least 30 to 35 years old. So that was quite sad for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can imagine.
Well, I think that wraps our show up for tonight. I want to thank both of y'all for calling in. And Becky, if you're out there, I want to thank you for calling in too.